Together Church has been many things to many people over the years, and even a name change recently.
Yeah, we were Western Hills.
Formerly Western Hills Church. And currently one of the partners that we walk with is the RDN. First of all, what does that stand for?
The Relational Discipleship Network.
The Relational Discipleship Network. And that's been a very instrumental part of who we are today and the engine that drives our church. And we've learned a lot from them. But can you tell us more about them, like what they are, what they do, why we associate with them, and how our partnership works?
Well, again, in this podcast, we're always trying to go back to not assuming anything, and understanding the biblical reasons for stuff. And this is a tough one. The church has been trying to figure out for a long time as it grew globally. At first, it was pretty easy to figure out how to work together. But as the church grew globally, how do you work together? How much should you work together? Should it be one hierarchy? Should you have someone at the top, like a pope, and everything kind of comes down through that hierarchy? Should every local church be autonomous? If they are autonomous, should they collaborate? Or should it just be, well, this is my church, that's your church? And I think we see a lot of problems in that, where we see churches that probably would get along well and align well and are trying to accomplish very similar, if not the same biblical mission, being a mile or two apart, but almost being like enemies.
Yeah, never linking arms for greater good.
Oh yeah, they stole 2 of our people last year, and we're still kind of upset about that. And so it's almost like we become opponents.
Yeah, being at odds.
Competing with each other. And so we've got to answer the question, well, how does the church work together? That before we even talk about what this network is, how should the church be working together? And God designed his church to be one. When you look in the New Testament, there's not, on this rock I will build 6 billion different churches. It's on this rock I will build my church. And we see all through the New Testament in Paul's writing, there's one spirit, one body, and that body is the body of Christ, which is the church. And so there's only one church. God, whatever God says about the church in the New Testament, whatever he says about what should characterize it, how it should organize, what its leadership should be, what it should do in its gatherings, whatever God prescribes is true for the church. All church. There's this principle that we talk about sometimes in worship. It's normative worship versus regulative worship. Okay, normative worship is what is the normal thing that happens in the world? Like, how are people finding ways that they want to worship God? This is like a summary of normative worship. And so it's like, in other words, this view says God is willing to receive worship in any way I want to give it. And so what connects with me? How should I give God worship? Regulative worship is, no, God prescribes, he regulates, he prescribes what worship for him should look like, and we need to come into alignment and worship the King in the way that he says, worship me like this. And so, at Together Church, we believe, no, God does prescribe in his word what worship should look like. And worship is not just the weekend gathering. It's not just
music,
the songs we sing.
Music.
It's allegiance to the King.
Yeah.
It's in the way I live my life. It's alignment with him. And so, we're trying to worship the Lord and follow him. And whatever that is for the global church is what it is for every church. But in the scriptures, there's one church, but there are many local churches. We get this idea all over the New Testament, like Paul writing to the church, we're in the series right now, of the Thessalonians, right? Or he writes to the church in Ephesus, or any of those places. And so Corinth, he writes to these different churches. So while it's true that there's only one church of Jesus, there are lots of local churches. In Revelation, Jesus is the judge of 7 specific churches and says things that he's pleased with and things he's not pleased with. So Jesus is even evaluating these local churches. And what he's evaluating is what kind of expression are they in their context to his church? How well do they reflect to the world in their unique context and environment and situation? How do they reflect to the world what it means to be Jesus's church? And we need to understand that when we're thinking about how should the church work together. There is only one church. There are not many churches of Jesus Christ, but there are many local expressions of that one church. And every local expression has a responsibility of studying out the scriptures and finding out, what does Jesus prescribe? What does God prescribe? What are the regulative acts of worship? How should we approach worshiping God with our lives, the lives we live and the things we do? What does that look like? And it might be expressed slightly different in certain contexts and places, but the heart of it, like that we make disciples, that we preach the word, that we are generous in our giving, that we sing songs of worship. These things that are found in the scriptures, that are prescribed in the scriptures, should mark every local church. And our job is getting better and better at expressing to our local community what the church is and reflecting Jesus' church. So when we ask that question, or when we start looking at, should the church be a hierarchy? What should the church be? Well, if the church is a hierarchy biblically, there's only one head. And that head is Jesus Christ.
Right. Can be no other.
That's right. And we are his body and individually members of it. And God has given leaders in his church who are to lead the local churches to try to steer the church to be the reflection God wants it to be. Accountable to the head, accountable to Christ, to shepherd the church, pastors, to shepherd the church, to reflect Jesus' church to that local place, that local context. And here's the truth, bottom line, some are better at doing it than others. Have you ever stepped in a church environment where you went into maybe a local church and you thought, I don't know what it is, but I don't feel very comfortable here?
Yeah, I've been at this church a very long time,
Right?
since I was like 10, so I don't get that experience a lot. But there have certainly been times where I've visited somewhere and it's not been the same. But there's been other times that I've been at churches that the culture is similar.
Right.
And it's just like being home.
It feels like home.
Mhm.
And maybe in some ways what's happening there is they're reflecting in the relational environment that they're sharing. They're reflecting what Jesus wants believers to share. I don't even know you, but you're already part of the family.
Right.
We are on the same mission. I already care about your well-being, and I want to see you thrive as a disciple of Jesus. Like, it's like assumed. I don't even have to know your name yet.
Mhm.
I want that for you because we are the church. And because churches are better at this, some are better at this than others. Some are further along in the process of figuring out what it looks like. None of us do this with perfection. We all have strengths and weaknesses in our flesh, in our humanity, in our collaboration as a local church in trying to reflect Jesus through his church. And so because we struggle with that and have some strengths but some weaknesses, what we need is to not bottle up and to just be, we'll figure this out. We don't need anyone else. No, there's so much to be learned and gained through our brothers and sisters in Christ in other local churches in what they're learning and figuring out about how to fulfill Jesus' mission, to go into the world and make disciples, and how to become disciples, and it not just be something we do, but it's who we are. And so we need these relationships with other churches to help us along in the process.
And I'm assuming that's where the RDN comes in for Together Church.
Now we're back. Yeah.
And we find a lot of that connection through churches that are a part of the RDN. There's a lot of commonality in culture and in desire
Yeah.
for what the church is accomplishing.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's a network of churches working together, trying to help each other become better at being a reflection in their local community of Jesus Church and fulfilling Jesus' mission. And we've had this in a lot of ways historically. Really, in some ways, not exclusively. There was actually a lot of reasons for this, but one of the reasons for the form of denominations was groups of churches working together with common alignment to fulfill God's mission
Right.
for the church. And so this isn't new. This isn't unique. In fact, Together Church still cooperates with Oklahoma Baptist. And so we're still part of that denomination. And so, so then we say, well, why the RDN? Well, here's what I like. The landscape just is constantly shifting and changing. What a denomination might have meant when it was formed hundreds of years ago and what it is today may not be the same. What it does to collaborate may not be the same. The RDN is not a denomination.
Multi-denominational?
The RDN is not non-denominational. It is what you said. It is multi-denominational. Now, it is aligned through an evangelical belief, and there's core tenets about who God is, who we are, what is the gospel, what is Jesus' mission for the church, but it's very summarized and it's very much the essentials of the faith. Yeah, like what we believe from a biblical standpoint, this is the core of what it means to be Christian.
Right.
And so it's not a broad list. It doesn't push into those nuanced denominational areas.
Differences.
Right. It says, here's the core things that the church needs to align on if we're going to be in partnership to fulfill Jesus' mission. And then it says, if we align, let's go. And it's going to provide resources and coaching and training. Come to our church. We want to spend some time with you. We'll come to your church and we're going to spend some time with your people. And together we're going to not create something new, not something normative, not like what's the catchiest new way to do Sunday mornings, or what's the newest curriculum that's taking the world by storm, or the buzzword or the gimmick or the podcast or the anything like that. What it's asking is, let's not create something new. Let's rediscover something old. We believe in aligning ourselves with what worship really is according to what Jesus has prescribed. And what he has told us to do is go make disciples. That should be the engine that drives the church. And so if we're going to be good at that, if the gates of hell are not going to prevail against us, if the church is going to win, then what we have to be able to do is understand, well, what does it look like for us to make disciples like Jesus? And it truly is better caught than taught. And there are churches further along in the process of imitating Jesus and his example than we have been, and even than we are right now. And so in the RDN, we get to find those churches, and we've made trips. We've gone to different places where they're putting on a conference, but really what they're doing is gathering people, like-minded Christians who are committed to the mission of Jesus in all these local contexts. They are one church, and they're gathering the church, and they're saying, how can we learn from each other and fulfill the mission of Jesus better? And you've walked into some of those environments. We went to Post Falls, Idaho together.
Yeah, it was really encouraging and just a great place to be. The culture is similar for those churches that are gathering, that are part of the network. And so when we were split up into groups, they split us up by title.
Like some roles in the church, different roles we play.
Different areas of ministry. And so I was with other pastors' wives, and it was amazing how quickly we got to real stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, we just didn't mess around at all.
Yeah.
Because it was all part of what we already knew that we were implementing in our own churches and places of worship and in spiritual growth and all of those things. But then when we were together, we were able to just get right to work. And it was such a blessing. It was incredible, very encouraging, and being able to be encouraged, but also to encourage others was phenomenal.
Yeah. And I remember you sharing that experience marked you. In fact, we went back to another conference one time and they didn't do it quite the same way. And your comment was, oh, it was really good. I enjoyed, but I really missed that particular, because of how much, you were sitting with people. And like you just said, they're all in different churches, local expressions of the church, but they're all in the same church. We're all part of Jesus' church. We're all disciples of Jesus. And so the RDN is one of the networks. They're not the only one, but they're one of the networks helping bring local churches together to learn from each other, to strengthen each other. And so we're still autonomous. I think it's an important question. Like some people have asked, well, if the RDN says to do it, does Together Church just do it?
Yeah.
There are definitely ways that God has led us to do things differently than what other churches in the RDN are doing. And we have a plurality of elders here who provide spiritual leadership. We go and we learn things, and then we ask, now, how does that look here? And what are the things we can't compromise because what we're learning is just simply what Jesus did, and we need to imitate it? And then what are the things that are some modern ideas and some practices, but we don't want to slip into normative worship and say, well, if that's the buzzword or working there, then we're going to cookie cutter it over here. No, we have a responsibility to shepherd and to steward the local church at Together Church in South Oklahoma City. And so we are autonomous. We do have our own leadership here, but I just feel like I'd be a fool if I wasn't willing to learn from some others.
Yeah.
If I wasn't rubbing shoulders with people who were doing this better. And then it opens doors. We started this shift for us that we first connected with the RDN in 2012. And so we've been on the shift for more than a decade now. And
You say the shift.
Okay.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so the shift is the engine that drives the church. It's a disciple shift. It's no longer the Sunday morning gathering going to be the engine that drives or the programs of the church, but that these are going to be things that are used to fuel the engine that drives the church, which is making disciples, watching how Jesus made disciples, raising up spiritually mature disciples of Jesus in the church. That's the engine. We're going to make disciples. That's the mission.
Okay.
And everything else is going to come and aid that, not the other way around. And so we started the disciple shift with the RDN in 2012. Well, now, a couple years ago, we were invited. We're now one of the coaching churches in the RDN. So where we sat in Zoom calls and circles and conferences and made phone calls and got new material and we're learning and
Had all
trying
the questions.
rolling it all out, making mistakes and trying to figure out what it looks like for us here to follow Jesus to the best of our ability. And we're still doing all that, but we've had some practice now and we're further along in the process. Now we get to turn around and our church is coaching 3 other churches. Yeah. And we're privileged, me and another staff member at church, we're privileged to sit on a Zoom call every other week with these pastors and be able to share what we're learning and talk. And I'm still learning from them, but they're learning a lot we're passing on the things we've learned from others. And then like one of those churches recently asked, could we come and do a disciple shift, regional is what they're called in the RDN, a regional disciple shift with their specific church and do some training for how to make disciples. So they're in Canada. So this is like, well, let's see if we can align a mission trip to Canada to help strengthen the church. And how cool is that?
Amazing.
For the church to work together like that. And then one other opportunity I think is important to mention because some might be thinking, I feel called into spiritual leadership in the church. Like maybe God's calling you to be a pastor or to be on staff at a church or to lead in some way. Well, another way we're working together is there's the residency, which is in cooperation with the RDN. And it's a place that it's not your typical education model where it's like a just-in-case model. Like I went and got my 4-year bachelor's and then I got my master's degree and you're kind of building these credentials for whatever might happen. The residency is a just-in-time model where it's like I feel called to get started as a disciple maker, but I need some boots on the ground, hit the ground running,
let's go.
Give me the crash course. Let's
Yes.
go. It's only 6 months long. It's not very expensive. It's 9 months if you want to do the church planning side. God might be calling some church planners out there. And this is something very affordable that through the RDN, our church has this opportunity. We've had 2 from our church already go through it. And I'd like to see many more where they can connect to the residency and get this just-in-time education and make disciples. So that's another pretty cool opportunity. So it's all about that collaboration. We're trying to answer the question, how do we work together? What does that look like to be one church, but a local expression? What's our part in that? And the RDN, the Relational Discipleship Network, helps us do that.
To partner with them, did we just say, hey, we want to partner with you all? How do we do that?
Yeah, if there was a church that wanted to get involved, there's some great books to read, like Church is a Team Sport by Jim Putman or
Good resource.
Yeah, Intentional by Brandon Gindin. I love that book for discipleship. But then if there was a church that wanted to get involved in that, then they would go to Discipleship. That's a conference. And you kind of get your introduction to what this, and then in our church, if there's people who want to get more familiar with it, we do DXP every year with it, which is the discipleship experience. It's kind of like our internal discipleship. It's where we do hands-on training. You're not going to sit in a lecture. You're going to get involved, get engaged in learning discipleship principles and being able to live that out in our local church as a team.
Which is honestly one of the best ways to do it, because we say it's better caught than taught. And it's not just the lectured, but to experience it, to experience people getting real, to experience that example of this is how we're going to, share real life relationships with one another. It just happened. It breaks down the walls in ways that I hadn't seen before.
Yeah.
And it really is something that's better caught than taught. So when you can get into that hands-on experience, it's going to propel you forward much further in the process, much faster.
That's right. So if you're listening, and whether you are someone who is being discipled or you're discipling someone else, we all have a responsibility to ask, how are we going to come in partnership with Jesus Church? Certainly that starts by getting involved in a local church and doing your part to help that church become an expression of the church, to reflect what Jesus Church is to your community around you. But then we all need to be asking, what are some other ways, instead of seeing churches as competition, and I have my church, they have their church, and comparing, how can we come together and work as a team to help each other through this process of learning to ultimately follow the example of Jesus, become mature disciples of Jesus who can make mature disciples of Jesus. So we encourage you, get involved and find a small group or a local community of believers in your local church that will help you grow in that process.